listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbigat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Last week we reported in the headlines about military drills that China has been carrying out around Taiwan. And just to give an idea on how intense these were, China had jets carrying live missiles flying over Taiwan while naval warships lay off the coast in strategic locations.
These military activities and exercises, of course, are planned weeks or months in advance. So really, irrespective of what President Lai would or would not have said, these military exercises would inevitably be carried out.
In today's deep dive, you'll hear all about the current tensions and whether we're any closer to the worst-case scenario for Australia, which would see our biggest trading partner, China, go to war with our most important military ally, the US. But first, it's time for the headlines with Helen Smith. Today's Tuesday, May 28th.
Israel's Prime Minister has described the airstrike which hit a displacement camp in Gaza's southernmost city as a tragic mishap. At least 45 people, more than half of which were women, children and the elderly, were killed in the attack after fire spread through an encampment of refugees in Rafah. Benjamin Netanyahu has told Israeli parliament that an investigation is underway and that the Israel Defense Forces had used its best efforts not to harm those uninvolved in the conflict.
Yeah, horrific images of the charred remains of civilians have spread since the attack, which the IDF claims had been targeting Hamas after it fired rockets at Tel Aviv. It came just days as well after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to stop its attacks on Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians have been sheltering. Of course, Helen, in the wake of this, there's been widespread global condemnation of this latest civilian loss of life in Gaza. The EU has come out to insist that Israel respect a ruling made by the ICJ, which was that one that Israel stop its operations in Rafah. The UN's human rights chief said the attack suggested there'd been no apparent change in the method and means of warfare used by Israel that have already led to so many civilian deaths. And back home in Australia, we have heard from Labor Senator Fatima Payman. She came out just a month or so ago to condemn Australia's support of Israel. She made very strong comments, the strongest from our government. She's labelled this attack as deplorable and she's once again called on the government to do something. This time she's asking it to stop trade with Israel and also recognise a Palestinian state. Now, the other big impact of this is on ceasefire talks. They were set to resume on Tuesday local time, and Qatar has said this latest strike could hinder those ongoing negotiations, which is just awful news.
Yeah, and my eye at the moment is really on the response from the US government. As we know, earlier in May, Biden did say that he would stop sending bombs and artillery shells to Israel if they launch a major invasion of Rafah. Then less than a week later, the White House told Congress that they had plans to send more than $1 billion US in new weapons to Israel. So I really want to see a strong stance from the US. Either way, make it clear who you are supporting and what you are doing. I just think it's going to be interesting to see what they decide, as unfortunately, we might see more attacks on Rafah. Yeah,
it is worth noting that the US's quote-unquote red line on this is a ground invasion of Rafah. We have heard from the US, a spokesperson, called it awful and, the usual platitudes when something like this happens. But you're right, it will be interesting to see if this latest loss of civilian life, which is so tragic and the images are just horrific, whether that'll prompt more action from the US.
There are fears that the death toll from the landslide in Papua New Guinea may be in the thousands, as a government agent predicts more than 2,000 people could have been buried alive. Now, that number is far higher than the previously thought figure of 670 by the United Nations, as around 3,800 people had been living in the area before the disaster.
Yeah, people are continuing to search for survivors and remove bodies and remains using whatever they can get their hands on. People have been using sticks. They've been using their own hands to dig at the rubble. Some areas of the rubble reach 10 metres deep. Remaining residents are being told to evacuate the area because it's in a high-risk spot. The land is still very unstable. And now there are forecasts of more rain, which will just make things even more dangerous. Australia, meantime, has confirmed it's sending technical experts and $2.5 million in initial aid.
The next step in Anthony Albanese's plan to stamp out violence against women will take place today, with a meeting of experts happening in Canberra. The Prime Minister announced $1.3 million in funding for the rapid review earlier this month. Among the experts, a journalist, a former assistant police commissioner, and a men's health research director to be headed up by Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner Michaela Cronin. The group will discuss how to best prevent gender-based violence and has been tasked with advising the government on the best way forward.
So this was all announced as part of that response to gender-based violence where Anthony Albanese, we saw the rallies right across the country. We saw the announcement of $920 million for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence situations. This is another part of that response. Anthony Albanese, has said that this approach of having these experts sit down is supposed to represent a whole of society approach that's needed to tackle domestic violence and gender-based violence, which I think makes sense, having all people from different walks of life who have experience. So, we heard there's a journalist there, so they have experience reporting on it. We've got someone from police, we've got these experts there to try and figure out what else we can do. And it's specifically focused around prevention, this review today. Femicide Watch claims 39 women have been killed by a man in Australia since the start of the year. So we've been told that's an almost 30% increase on last year's figures, but that 30% increase was recorded about a month ago, and we've had more women killed since. So it'll be interesting to see if the statistics represent that and it's actually a higher increase than what we've already seen.
Come fly with me, let's fly away.
And the world's oldest flight attendant has died at 88 after almost 67 years in the sky. Her name was Betty Nash. She started flying in 1957 after being drawn to the glamour and romance of the job. Oh, I don't know if flight attendants would say that these days. Betty had spoken in the past about wanting to become a flight attendant after catching her very first flight when she was just 16 years old. And this is what she had to say a few years back on why she had stayed in the role for so long.
I love my people. And I love being on the same flight all the time, that I know my customers, what they want. The airline thinks names are important, but I think a lot of times people's needs are very important. Everybody wants a little love.
On CNN there.
Yeah, and in 2022, Betty was given the title by the Guinness World Record for the longest serving flight attendant when she was 86 years old. Now, Betty actually never officially retired from her role with American Airlines and sadly did pass away on May 17th after being diagnosed with breast cancer. However, I found this really interesting. What Betty recalled when she first started in the job is that you had to be a certain height and weight, and that they would have regular weigh-ins. And if you happened to put on a few extra pounds and keep those pounds on, they would take you off payroll.
It was a completely different world. The world of flight attendants, if you watch period dramas that involve flighties and the stuff that they had to go through. Also, I was watching the CNN, they did this big thing with her when she hit 60 years in the sky, which was 7 years ago. And she was talking about like the smoking cabins. So people used to sit and smoke in planes. And can you imagine if you're like, even if you're a smoker, how awful that would be? Like, she has seen it all. And I think what an incredible story of this woman who, she was a single mum. She had a son with Down syndrome. She flew the same route every day so that she could be home in time to be with her son. Like, what an amazing woman. I think one of the newspapers said it best when they said, "Fly high, Betty. Enjoy your rest." Helen, thank you for being here for the headlines. Next up is our deep dive into the latest tensions between China and Taiwan.
China carried out a series of military drills around Taiwan late last week. These were an exercise in intimidation, aimed at punishing the self-governing island's newly re-elected president for his inauguration speech. Lai Ching-te told a crowd in Taiwan that the country was a sovereign and independent nation with sovereignty resting in the people. Them's fighting words as far as China's concerned. China claims Taiwan as part of its territory and has long threatened a military invasion to achieve what it describes as the reunification of Taiwan into China. If China ever carried out such a threat, it would risk all-out war with the US, pitting the country most vital to Australia's economy, China, against the country most vital to our national defence, the US. So do these latest military drills mean we're one step closer to that worst-case scenario? Or is this just China flexing its muscle? Dr Roger Lee Huang from Macquarie University is an expert in the politics, international relations and security of Southeast Asia, and he's here to help us understand the situation. Doctor, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. How worried should Australians be about these latest military drills from China around Taiwan?
So the latest military drill from China near Taiwan waters is really perhaps the largest military exercise we've seen since the 2022 military exercise after Nancy Pelosi, the then Speaker of the U.S. House, to Taiwan. This is a serious escalation. I believe this is for the first time the People's Liberation Army has actually entered what is known as restricted waters by the Taiwanese sides near the small islands in Mazu, Jinmen, and Wuqiu, which are these islands that's under Taiwanese control and sovereignty, but much closer to China than it is to Taiwan. So for the first time, we're looking at, I believe, the PLA in conjunction with the Coast Guards, the Chinese Coast Guards, carrying out these exercises. So it should give people pause. But then again, I'm not suggesting that we should be hiding our bunkers anytime soon.
The new Taiwanese president, Lai Ching-te, seems to be walking a dangerous tightrope. So he's asserting Taiwan's sovereignty and also trying not to poke the bear in China and bringing on an actual war. Do you think that he'll be able to maintain that balance?
So Lai Ching-te, or also known as his English name as William Lai, is an interesting figure because he is a long-time politician that has really worked from the grounds up, right? So he's worked in local politics in Taiwan, and he has been perceived, especially by kind of perhaps the more radical pro-independence groups, as kind of the golden child, golden grandson, as they sometimes call him in Taiwan, of independence. So in many ways, whether it's China as well as the broader international community, I think there's been this kind of focus on him as a potential provocateur, right? Potentially leading Taiwan to a more formal, outright public independence. Now, just to be clear, Taiwan, of course, has been a de facto independent country really since the 1940s, at least since 1949, after the founding of the People's Republic of China. Now, the People's Republic of China under the Chinese Communist Party has never governed or controlled Taiwan, not for a single day. These are just facts. Right. So what William Lai has done in actuality is actually moving again towards more of the mainstream position in Taiwan, which is that, and this is reflected in his inauguration speech just a few days ago, that Taiwan, or Republic of China, which is the official name of Taiwan, is already an independent country. Right. What he has said isn't really that much different from previous presidents since Taiwan had direct presidential elections in 1996. Now, what is slightly different from past presidents is that he basically refused to even entertain the idea or the myth, right? This white lie, if you will, that there is only one China. Now, that is where China, the People's Republic of China, draws a line where it wants to create this kind of idea that there's only one China, and both Taiwan and China belong under this one China, and this is what China often calls its one China principle. Now, just to end on this point, because I also don't want to exaggerate how the inauguration speech and William Lai's refusal to talk about the 1992 consensus as being a reason or justification for China's latest military action. That is that these military activities and exercises, of course, are planned weeks or months in advance. So really, irrespective of what President Lai would or would not have said, these military exercises would inevitably be carried out, and would just be something that the Chinese side would pick out as being particularly offensive to justify these, in many ways, exaggerated military exercise over the advent of a new presidency.
Speaking of the one China policy, Australia has a one China policy of its own, and we're walking our own diplomatic tightrope. Why is it important that Australia maintain this kind of have it both ways policy where we don't acknowledge Taiwan as having a sovereign government, but we do support democracy around the world?
So the one China policy that Australia has is actually very similar to what most democracies have, right? Whether it's the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, etc. And the one China policy that these democracies have is very different from what China calls the one China principle. So this is the first thing I think we need to really pay attention to, because China often likes to kind of equate both as being the same, and they're not. Now, like you said, what Australia and other democracies do with their one China policy is that officially they recognize People's Republic of China as China. But at the same time, Australia acknowledges China's position, and this is what's important. It doesn't actually say it recognizes Chinese position on Taiwan. It acknowledges China's position, which in diplomatic talk is pretty much saying, yes, we heard what you said. We hear that China perceives or claims Taiwan as part of its territory. We hear it, but we're not going to comment on it. We're not going to say we agree or disagree, right? So it's just diplomatic talk, which then allows the flexibility for Australia and other countries to continue to engage Taiwan unofficially, so without formal diplomatic relationship. But this allows Australia to continue to trade with Taiwan, to also support Taiwan in different ways, even though it doesn't have official diplomatic relationships. Because if you go to Canberra, you'd see there is a Taiwan trade office where there is basically a de facto Taiwanese ambassador who is not called ambassador, he's called a representative, but basically, has pretty much all the same kind of expectations you would have for a diplomat, with just the unofficial recognition.
The absolute worst case scenario from Australia's perspective, and of course the world's perspective, I think it's fair to say, would be a full all-out war between China and the US over Taiwan. Can you first briefly remind us why the US has such an interest in Taiwan? And secondly, how close do you think we are to that horrific possibility?
So Taiwan is in a geopolitically important location that continues to serve U.S. kind of interest in the area. The second thing is, I think, of course, the idea of democracies, right? One, it already has this long relationship with the United States, even though it's been unofficial since 1979. But the United States has a series of laws that were passed after they broke ties with Taiwan in recognition of China, which says that they will at least provide means for Taiwan to defend itself. So this is the Taiwan Relations Act that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1979. And then subsequently, and I don't want to bore your listeners with all the legal details, but there were subsequent measures that the United States has passed, such as Sixth Assurance and all these other things, which continues to mean that the United States will support Taiwan right to defend itself against any potential, threat from China.
And how close are we to an actual conflict?
So, in terms of the potential for a conflict, there's a lot of people quoting the General Secretary of China, or the so-called President of China, Xi Jinping, that Xi Jinping has said to his army to be militarily capable of launching an invasion in 2027. So this is what people have quoted. But realistically speaking, I don't think there's an actual timeline of when China might carry out an invasion. I don't think anyone actually want to see an actual kinetic force being used. The scariest thought is the potential for something to go wrong, right? The escalation of tension because of military exercise that goes wrong, or because of unintentional clashes, or a trigger-happy pilot or a navy or something. But in terms of actual war plans, I'm sure Beijing is making war plans just as DC and Canberra and Tokyo and Taipei are. But I don't think anyone has an actual timeline to say we were going to invade Taiwan by 2027 or an X amount, in the X year. But there are certain things, like I said, that could provoke a more outright aggression or war. One, as I already said, any kind of accidents that happen during these kind of patrols, military exercises, or when the Chinese kind of cross the de facto median line of Taiwan, or if Taiwan perhaps do something that is perceived as being provocative, right? If President William Lai formally declare a name change, where again, as I've like to remind your listeners, a Republic of China as being the official name of Taiwan. Of course, no one really knows this name anymore. But if William Lai actually says, we are now going to rename ourselves as the Republic of Taiwan. We're going to change our flag. We're going to change our national anthem and call ourselves the Republic of Taiwan. If something like that dramatically happens, then yes, that might provoke a more outright aggression from China. But to be fair, I don't think we're anywhere near there, and I don't think there's any intention of William Lai to do anything remotely like that in the foreseeable future.
Well, let's all hope that it stays that way. Thanks so much for your time, Dr. Huang.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Roger Lee Huang there. That's it for the briefing this morning. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.